Morning all, we're going to make a start now. So I'm Amy and I'd like to welcome you to our fourth education specific webinar. We continue the theme from our 2016 autumn series where we were looking at how educators are using interactive tools, but this week we're looking more directly at how one particular user is using Meetoo and how they've incorporated the technology in their classes and the results he's seen from it. So today we're very pleased to welcome our guest speaker Neil Pickles from the University of Chester, who's a very active user of Meetoo and has been for the last year. Before I hand over to Neil, I just wanted to encourage you to take part in the Meetoo session. So this will help you get the most out of the webinar today, as Neil will be asking a few questions via the live polling, as will I towards the end of the webinar. To join Meetoo, follow the instructions on screen. To participate in the session, either download the app by searching the Apple or Google Play Store, or go to your web browser and type in web.meetoo.io. You'll then be prompted for a code, so enter the 9-digit code 174386907. It's a great opportunity to ask Neil questions directly, and we'll go through them at the end of today's session. Don't forget to like others' comments. It will help us understand what are the most important questions to answer at the end. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Neil, who will get started with the webinar today.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone, for registering and listening to this webinar. I hope you get a lot out of it. I should start with saying that this is my personal point of view in terms of how I use interactive tools for group discussion in large lectures and to produce peer-led teaching. It's not an exhaustive account, but it is an account of how I have used Meetoo in particular to improve engagement and why engagement is important as well. And so the first thing I should do is tell you a little bit about myself. So I will do that now. So just to point out who I am, I am a Deputy Head of Department in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Chester, and I'm also a Senior University Teaching Fellow, which means I'm partly responsible for teaching initiatives and teaching process and policies and improving the student experience. My subject specialism is biochemistry and microbiology, but from an educational point of view, I have 14 years of teaching experience. I'm a fellow of the Higher Education Authority and hold a teaching certificate. But as well as biochemistry and microbiology, I teach general topics such as research methods and data handling, and more specific topics like molecular biology. And you can see that I've had experience at a number of different institutions and currently at the University of Chester. And you can see my social media details are on the right-hand side, so please feel free to follow me on social media as well. And just to point out, as Amy said, at the bottom of the screen there you can see the web link so you can join in on today's session with the Meetoo app. So what am I going to try and cover today? Well, highlight my use of Meetoo to increase engagement in learning activities. And I use the phrase learning activities in a deliberate sense because I believe that the sessions that I give with students should be about learning activities. It's about their learning rather than my teaching. So I'm going to demonstrate how I've adopted Meetoo and how it's seen a large increase in engagement. And then I'm going to showcase some examples. I have many examples that I could use, but I've just highlighted a few that show you how I approach it with small and large group teaching. So, if we talk about my history of interactive technology, there's a quote at the top: students are always on their phone or laptop. This was a conversation that happened during a staff meeting a number of years ago, and some staff were concerned that students were in sessions and they were using their phone and laptop and so on. So I decided to turn the problem around on its head. Rather than worrying about students using technology, how can we get them to use their laptop, phone tablet device in sessions to improve their learning. And that's when I realised that if we can use that, then the students can engage. And learning should be activity driven. And if learning is activity driven, then the students engage with what they're doing and are more likely to learn. And the important thing is it becomes their learning rather than our teaching. I've used a number of different platforms here. There are other platforms out there, but I found that Meetoo gives me the best mix of being able to pose questions very easily, being able for the students to access it easily, and also being able to export. So that's why I use Meetoo. And I've used it for many different reasons. So I've used it for lectures, I've used it in practical sessions, and hopefully what you'll get out of today is I'll give you some examples of how I've used it in the learning and teaching that I do. So we're going to carry on now and talk about a poll. So if you have access to the Meetoo app, what I'd like to do is gauge your experience. I'm aware that the participants that are listening, some of you might be academics, some of you might be study skills individuals, and some of you might be learning technologists and so on. So I'll just give you a minute or so to answer via the app, if you don't mind, please, and then we can see where we're at. So you can see there's a number of options there. In terms of me, I use it regularly, at least once a month, often every week, 2 or 3 times. So it'd be interesting to see. So we can see that we have 54% use it regularly, which is really good to see. But we also have some people who have about 20%, about 4%, very rarely or never. Then perhaps, hopefully, this webinar can give you more confidence, or at least give you a way in which you can use this technology. So that's good to hear as well. So now we've gauged your interest, let's talk about my first example, which is large group teaching. And this is an example of where I've used it for revision questions. In terms of what do we mean by a large group, people have different definitions, but I would define a large group as more than 50. And typically I teach student groups between 100 and 250 students at a time. And I was able to use this poll function in Meetoo in a large lecture room to be able to get students to engage. So if we talk about the problems in engaging large groups, again, teaching in large groups, it makes it difficult for effective learning. So these are some of the problems that you can get. One problem is it's not possible to speak to everyone, and so you can't interact individually. And it's mainly passive delivery. Because we have a large group, it's about transmitting information, and that's not really learning, that's just delivery of content. And that can make it difficult to collect responses, and also materials difficult to share. And again, all of these are not helping with them participating, they're just learning. And it's not their session. They don't feel it's their session, it's the person in front of them just transmitting information rather than the students being in control and actually learning. And the other part is that students are part of a large group. So they're protected by that large group, which means that they don't like engaging as much. That means they're less likely to lead the session. And ultimately, students don't like giving answers. We should never assume that students are willing to give answers, even if they're postgraduate students. I found that postgraduate students can be just as reticent as students in the first year of university study. So it's important that we give them the tools to engage. And that's where something like Meetoo can really come in. So we're now going to take another poll with you. So you can see there's up to 5 choices here. So what type of interactive activity would be useful in a large group? So when you're ready, send your answers. So the first option is revision for exams. And then the second option is answers to a learning exercise during a large lecture or session, or the ability for students to ask questions, or students to give opinions, and the last one, gathering feedback from students to see what they think of a session or a module, and so on. So we'll just give you another few seconds just to give an answer for this, and then We will look at the answers in a moment. So the answers should appear very soon. So there we go. So we can see that there's a mix here, but gathering feedback is one that's scored highly, so is answers to a learning exercise. Now, the really good thing about this is a platform like Meetoo allows you to do all of those things. And in fact, I've used Meetoo for all of these functions. And the gathering feedback one was particularly useful because it's difficult to get students' feedback, but also allowing them to ask questions. That was a real positive. Two things that aren't on this slide, which I could add as well, I've used it to collect experimental data during practical sessions, rather than having it write it down on paper, and also student requests, say for material, for projects and so on. They can ask for that during a session. So that's enough of polls for you. For now, I'm going to show you an example of a poll I took with my students. So this first example is using multiple choice questions. In our department, we use a lot of multiple choice questions at level 4, first year and second year students. So I used the poll feature, and the students use their own devices in general for this, phones and tablets and laptops and so on. So this was for revision for second years, and it was up to about 100 students in this lecture, and the key bit is it allowed for anonymous and instant feedback on how the students individually were doing to gauge their revision and how much they knew about content before the exam. But the biggest bonus to me was the level of engagement involved. And the engagement was 95%. And if you haven't taught a large group of students before, to get 95% of response rate from your students is unbelievable, really. But it is a true figure. I have to say engagement was about 20% before then, but pretty much full engagement. So I found that really useful and really important. And the other thing I should say is that for things like multiple choice questions and so on, I do give them a time limit, and that's to give them a realistic expectation of what happens in the exam and how long you get per question. And Meetoo does allow a function now. You can have a countdown timer that the students can see when they're answering the questions. Okay, so if we look at example questions, now I'm aware that you're here for a webinar on Meetoo. I know you're not studying the biology of disease, so I'm not expecting you to have to answer these questions. If you want to in your own time, then that's absolutely fine. But you can just see some of the questions that I'm asking the students. And these are from previous exam questions, so it gauges their level of revision. The important thing about Meetoo is it's very easy to write these questions. I can copy and paste from Word and from PowerPoint, and the options that come up, the A, B, C, D, and E, and so on, they automatically upload when you do this, so it's very easy to use. So it's useful for continual formative assessment with students. So they're just a snapshot of some of the questions that I asked students. On the next slide, you'll see one of the most useful aspects of Meetoo, and this was an aspect I wasn't aware of when I first used Meetoo, and then when I realized you could use this function. You can export all of the answers to Excel, and if you haven't used Meetoo before, it takes 5 seconds, if that, to download this export. So it's very, very useful, and you can store them. And there's a number of reasons why I would store these exports. I can give them to the students because it's anonymous, so they can see how they're performing. Also, external examiners. The external examiners for our programs like to see how students are responding to questions, to see if there's, say, problem questions that are answering, questions that are too difficult, and so on. This export shows how each student has done. Obviously, if we were to scroll down the Excel spreadsheet, you would see all of the responses, so you can see individual performance. However, the next slide will show the performance for each question. One thing I should point out is that now Meetoo has a function where it highlights the correct answers, both on the previous slide and on this one. I haven't got it on here because this is an older version, but you can show the correct responses on here as well. and the students get to see whether they've answered the question correctly during the session. And this allows me to look at each question and to see if there's any problem questions. So it's very, very useful. You can quickly identify problem questions. There was no way for me to capture this in previous lectures. So this is a particular bonus of using this system. So moving on to the second example, we can see that I'm looking at student opinions now. And this is the larger challenge. This is a bigger challenge, both for large and small groups. Students might be willing to answer questions multiple choice, but getting students to tell me what they think is a bigger challenge. So engaging students with discussions. And this is because at university level, we want the students to show creative thinking, we want them to show critical thinking, and also synthesis. We want them to synthesize new ideas, new thoughts, new theories, and so on. So this is an important aspect, and this is probably the biggest area that I've found in Meetoo that has really allowed me to improve engagement. But of course, a question that I could have asked at the start, which is worth using now, is why do we use interactive technology? And the key bit is there should be a reason for adopting. You won't be surprised to hear that I'm a fan of interactive technology, and I'm sure you are as well, but there needs to be a reason. And so I'll tell you the reason for this example. My case study was a research methods module. This is taken by all of our students in second year, and the students find it difficult because it's more about what they think and about analysing what research is rather than being able to recall facts. So it's about promoting independent thinking. Students struggle to confidently engage, so I'm using interactive technology like Meetoo to answer a specific problem, which is student engagement in opinions. In this example, you can do it via devices or you can use it in a computer room, it doesn't really matter, but I use Meetoo to get a real dialogue, and it becomes student-led. It becomes their session, and it's more responsive. And they not only respond to me, but they also respond to other students. So let's show you the example that I used. And the example that I used, and I should also say that engagement was 100%, rather than about 20%. So every single student engaged with this. So I want you to think like a student for a moment, if you will. This is the example I gave to the students. In order for them to understand experimental design, I give them this concept of the Mars 500 project, which has been completed, where they isolated Russian cosmonauts in a location that mimicked both the travel to and the living experience of being on Mars as a psychological experiment, and to see how they would do under this. Luckily, the film The Martian had just come out before I did this exercise, so the students liked this exercise and they engaged with it. So the question that I asked them, which we'll hopefully ask you now, is in order to make this experiment as accurate as possible, what needs to be controlled? What do we need to control in this experiment to make it as realistic to see how they respond to a Mars mission? So if we're able to, we'll give you a chance to answer this via the discussion board, a part of Meetoo, or the messaging function, and we'll see what we come up with. So if you do have any suggestions, put them via the app. While you're doing that, while you're thinking about this, just to reiterate the previous slide, every single student engaged, and I think that is something that doesn't often happen. Okay, so if we've been able to, we hopefully will see some responses based on the polling function.
I don't know if you can see now, but we've got a few responses come in there.
Okay, I can't see online.
Cool. So we've got food, isolation, sound, the environment, communication times, access, atmosphere, exposure to vision outside the Earth needs to be controlled for the environment, lighting and temperature. So yeah, quite good engagement there.
That's excellent. So you can see that was within 90 seconds, 2 minutes, we've had lots of answers. That was very good, but what I'd like to show you now is the responses I got from my students. If you don't mind me saying, yours was good, but theirs was even better, I have to say. And the important thing to point out here is this is a snapshot, a screenshot that I took of the Excel export. And so it's just an extract. 250 students attended these sessions. Every single student, 100%, provided at least one answer, with some providing more than one. So this runs on for pages and pages and pages. So the engagement was unbelievable, really. I was really pleased. And they gave lots of good answers, and it shows that they can understand how to think like a scientist. It's a very welcome sight. They thought about some things that I hadn't thought about, and the other good thing is that students can see each other's responses as well as me being able to see, and so they feed off each other, and there's dialogue, and there's a real learning experience that goes on there, and it builds their confidence for these answers. And another thing that's useful with this, if we go to the next slide, is that you can see there's a likes column. So and they can see this via Meetoo when they're doing it, and I'm sure you've been liking things, or you'll be liking things as you ask questions and so on. And again, the students can see which comments other students like in this response. And what I did with this export function was to export it on Excel and put it on our learning space. We use Moodle, a module space, and then the students can download this and actually use this as formative learning to help them with the assignment, which was thinking about research. So it helped them during the session and after the session. That's one of the key bits about being able to export. If we just go on to the next slide, you'll see I mentioned the film The Martian before. The most popular answer was that we should ask Matt Damon what to do on a trip to Mars. Okay, so that made them laugh as well. So humour can be effective, and even via interactive technology, humour can be as well. Okay, so that was just an example there.
We're actually seeing the same response there, Neil, on the Meetoo chat as well. So we've currently got 15 likes for Ask Matt Damon. So thank you very much, Daniel, for that answer.
That's a very good answer. Okay, so just to summarise, so thank you for taking part in that. So just to summarise, interactive technology should have a rationale, there should be a reason. It should be a replacement of what we're doing rather than just a bolt-on addition. So I use it to replace the older methods I use for student engagement. And it can really help with engagement both during sessions and to give students an output of the good work they've done during a session for them to learn about later on. And with Meetoo, the polling is useful for things like revision and for simple answers, and a messaging function allows for interactivity with opinions in different formats and for different reasons. So thank you for listening, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Neil. That was really great. I'm just having a look now to see if we've got any questions. Yes, okay, well, we've got a question here from Sarah. How do you manage answering questions from students via Meetoo?
That's a very good question. I started doing this in lectures, so I would have an iPad with me, but you can use any other device, not just Apple products. But I have an iPad with me at the front of the lecture, and so those questions can pop up and I can answer them as I go along during the lecture. So usually if I'm transitioning from, say, one slide to another, I'll check if there's any questions, so that works quite well.
Great. We've got another question here from Fiona. How long did it take you to get all the students to download the Meetoo app and become familiar with it before starting to use it?
I would say for that large group, 5 minutes. So I just gave myself 5 minutes at the start of the session for them to download. The most important thing is to remember to give them the meeting ID, which is something Amie was very clear about at the start of this session. As long as you give them the meeting ID, that takes the longest part. if you give them the meeting ID for 5 seconds and then you move on, they'll ask you for the meeting ID. But about 5 minutes, and we're talking over 100 students.
We have a question from Professor X. When do you identify participants as opposed to going anonymous?
That, again, is a very good question. I use the anonymous function almost exclusively. The only time where I would identify them is if it's a smaller group and there's an assessment involved with it, where I'm looking for their responses to, say, questions and answers in a poster session, something gauging their research. But I would always ask their permission before I use that function anyway, but I usually use anonymous.
And just a question there from my own interest there, Neil. Do you find engagement different if people are anonymous or not? Do you think people engage more if it's anonymous?
I think for large groups, yes, there's more engagement if it's anonymous. But for smaller groups who tend to be students who are in second and third year, engagement when it can be identified is just as strong because they know the people around them and they know me and they built up trust by then. But particularly for students you haven't met before, the anonymous function is better for engagement.
Okay, thanks. We've got a question from Pam. Is Meetoo standalone or does it work as an extension to PowerPoint?
Well, Amie can probably answer that question.
Yeah, so you don't need to run PowerPoint through, or Meetoo through PowerPoint. You can run it just from our web dashboard, which can also be run from a tablet. So yes, you can use our PowerPoint add-in. That's what we use today to run the polls. So either or. Yeah,
just to add to that, I've used the PowerPoint plugin just like you've seen on the webinar today. It's very easy to use, but I've also used Meetoo via my phone, my tablet, laptop, you name it. It works on any device.
We've got time for a couple more questions, but we are drawing to a close, so I might not be able to get through all of these. Have you brought the ability to have more than 100 students? I think that could be aimed more at me. We can, there isn't a limit of 100. The education free license allows you up to 100 participants, and there is a paid license after that for up to 1,000. If you needed more, it is possible to have more, but I don't think there's many lectures of over 1,000. No. How do you get the information into Moodle? Is there integration or is it uploaded? Any ideas over VLEs?
Well, with VLEs, I'm not sure the question is asking if using V2 via VLEs, but in terms of the exports that I get, I just upload those onto the module space, onto the Moodle space.
How can I prevent abusive or off-topic responses from being publicly displayed?
Again, that's a very good question, and that is a fear that some people have. If I know the students well, then I don't moderate the content, but if I'm worried about that, you can choose to review the responses before you allow them to be published on the system, because once they're published, the other students can see them. So if you're worried about that, just moderate it first. There's an option to automatically put them on or to moderate them first.
Great. I think we might have to draw the questions to a close. There is quite a few more there, but maybe Neil, if we have a look at them afterwards and we can respond to the questions when we send out the slides, if that's okay. Because we've just got, before we finish, we've just got a few questions we'd like to ask you. So I'm just going to post a couple of questions now into the Meetoo. So how useful was the webinar to you today? Very useful, quite useful, not useful at all, or not very useful, sorry, or not useful at all. Okay, so we'll take that there. And and we are saving our blushes and won't be revealing the answers to that, but hopefully all positive. And just some interest there in, the sorts of things that you would like from Meetoo in the future. We do have another webinar coming up in early February that's again from a guest speaker from Mick Wood at UCLan. Okay, we'll take that there just in the interest of, that's great. And where did you hear about today's webinar? And if you haven't already, there's actually a webinar that Dermot, one of my colleagues, is hosting, Tips on PowerPoint. It's been a very popular session, and that is on the 31st of January. That's great. Thank you for that. And I think that's it. We're 1 minute over, so thank you very much, Neil. And thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you.